The gavel had not yet fallen, but Michael Carter could already feel his entire life narrowing down to the next 60 seconds. Because in that packed Chicago courtroom, under lights so bright they made every face look pale and afraid, a jury was about to decide whether the man who once built one of America's largest logistics empires would walk free or be led away in chains for crimes he had never committed. And as he sat there, with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white, he told himself the one person who might have believed in him completely was gone, had been gone for 15 years, and would never walk through those doors. And it was at that exact moment, the moment he had finally surrendered to the silence, that the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room creaked open, and every head turned at once. A young woman stepped inside, dressed simply in gray, carrying a worn leather briefcase like it held the weight of the entire world. And she did not look at the cameras, did not look at the reporters scrambling to focus their lenses. She looked only at the front of the room. And Michael's heart stopped cold in his chest, because he knew that walk. He knew that chin lifted just a fraction too high. He knew the girl who had never once looked away from anything in her life. And after 15 years of silence, of missed birthdays and unanswered letters, Emily Brooks had come home. To understand how a man like Michael Carter ended up on trial for his own life, you have to go back nearly 30 decades, to a night so bitterly cold that even Chicago's shelters had turned people away at the door. Michael, then a hardened businessman in his mid-40s, with more money than he knew what to do with and less peace than he would ever admit to anyone, had gone beneath an abandoned railway bridge on the south side of the city to settle a supplier dispute that had refused to happen anywhere public. The meeting collapsed within minutes, the way most of his dealings did back then, cold and transactional and forgotten before he even reached his car. But as he turned to leave, his expensive shoes crunching over broken glass and frost, he heard something that froze him in place, a small, ragged cough, followed by a whisper so faint he almost mistook it for the wind. Huddled against the concrete wall, wrapped in a blanket that had long since stopped keeping anyone warm, sat a girl no older than 9, holding her little brother tight against her chest, as though her own thin body could somehow save him from the cold. When she looked up at Michael, her eyes held no fear at all, only a tired, ancient kind of alertness no child should ever have to carry. Michael, moved by something he could not yet name, pulled a thick fold of cash from his coat and held it toward her, expecting the reaction he always got from people: gratitude, relief, maybe tears. Instead, the girl looked him straight in the eyes and said 7 words that would quietly unravel everything he believed about the world. "We don't need your money," she said. "We need food." Something about the flatness in her voice, the complete absence of self-pity, cracked open a door inside Michael that 20 years of boardrooms and quiet bribes had never touched. He knelt down right there in the frost in his $3,000 suit and asked her name. Emily, she told him. Her brother, barely conscious now, was Thomas. Michael carried the boy to his car himself, refusing to wait for anyone, and drove straight to the nearest hospital, while Emily sat silent in the back seat, watching him with that same unreadable expression. The doctors worked through the night. Michael sat in the waiting room until dawn, something he had not done for another human being in longer than he could remember. And when the doctor finally walked out, her face said everything before her words did. Thomas had been fighting untreated pneumonia for days, and his small body simply had nothing left. He passed away just before sunrise. Michael braced himself for screaming, for the kind of grief that breaks a room apart, but Emily did none of that. She walked to every nurse who had tried to save her brother and thanked each one by name, her voice steady, her eyes dry, and then she turned and walked alone down the long hospital hallway, a 9-year-old girl carrying grief too heavy for grown men twice her age. It was in that hallway, watching her small shoulders refuse to shake, that Michael made the only truly selfless decision of his adult life. He walked toward her, knelt to her eye level, and asked if she would come home with him, not as charity, but as his daughter. Emily studied him for a long moment, weighing him the way she seemed to weigh everything in this world, and then she nodded once. She arrived at his mansion with nothing but a small backpack and a grief she refused to perform for anyone. And within weeks, she began doing something no one else in Michael's life had dared to do in 20 years. She challenged him. At 12, digging through old newspaper archives for a school project, she learned that her father's empire had been built partly on bribed officials and buried competitors, and instead of running from him, she sat him down at his own dinner table and asked, quietly, whether winning meant anything at all if you had to lie to get there. Michael, a man who had once silenced senators, found himself speechless in front of a child. Over the years that followed, their bond deepened in small, quiet ways that mattered more than anything money could buy. Sunday mornings spent teaching her to drive in the empty mansion parking lot. Late nights at the kitchen table, helping her rehearse debate arguments until she could out-argue him on any subject she chose. The birthday when she was 14 and refused every expensive gift he offered, asking instead for one full day where his phone stayed off and it was just the two of them at the lake house. He gave her that day, and years later he would remember it as one of the finest of his entire life. She grew into a young woman whose brilliance startled even the teachers who thought they had seen every kind of gifted child, graduating at the top of every class, earning scholarships no amount of her father's money could have purchased for her. At 18, she sat him down in his study and told him she had been accepted into a law program across the country and that she intended to go without his name on a single application, without his money covering a single tuition bill, because she needed to know that whatever she became, she had built with her own hands. Michael's heart broke quietly that night, the particular way hearts break when pride and grief arrive together.
But he drove her to the airport himself and stood on the tarmac long after her plane disappeared into the clouds. In the years that followed, the calls came less often, the letters slowed and then stopped altogether, and Michael told himself it was simply the natural drift of a daughter building her own life. But as months turned into years and years turned into more than a decade, the silence began to feel like something else entirely. He never once said a bitter word about her in public, even as reporters printed cruel little stories calling her the daughter who abandoned the man who saved her. But at home, in the quiet hours nobody saw, he kept her old bedroom exactly as she had left it, the same faded quilt, the same law textbooks stacked on the desk. And every year on her birthday, he sat alone at the kitchen table with 2 slices of cake, one for himself and one he never touched, because some part of him refused to stop believing she might still walk through that door. What Michael did not know, could not have known, was that during those same 15 years, a different kind of betrayal had been quietly growing inside the walls of his own company. Daniel Reed had joined Carter Global Logistics as a sharp-eyed young executive 2 decades earlier, and over the years he had built a reputation as the most loyal, most dependable man in the building, the one Michael trusted with contracts, with secrets, with decisions that could make or break the entire company. Daniel had a gift for it. The warm handshake, the concerned phone call at just the right moment, the way he would linger after board meetings to ask Michael how he was really doing since Emily left, his face arranged into perfect practiced sympathy while his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating which shell company needed funding next, which signature needed forging, which loyal old employee needed to be quietly pushed out before they noticed the numbers no longer matched. He built an entirely separate empire behind that trusted smile, one made of stolen funds and buried paperwork, each fraudulent transaction carefully disguised so that if anyone ever came looking, every road would lead directly back to Michael Carter, and Michael himself would never once suspect the man who brought him coffee on his worst days. By the time federal investigators arrived with warrants, the case against Michael appeared airtight. Former colleagues, some out of fear and some out of simple self-preservation, testified against him. Business partners severed ties overnight. The company that had once employed thousands of families across the country began collapsing in on itself. And Michael, the man who had weathered every storm the business world could throw at him, found himself sitting alone in a holding cell, waiting to learn whether he would spend what remained of his life paying for crimes he never committed. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom filled early, cameras positioned to capture the downfall of a man who had once graced the cover of every business magazine in the country. And Michael sat at the defense table, having made peace, he told himself, with whatever was coming, until the doors opened and Emily walked in. She crossed the room without a single glance at the cameras and asked the judge's permission to join the defense. And inside her worn briefcase was 15 years of evidence, bank records, hidden contracts, corporate filings, international transfers, every document gathered piece by piece to prove one impossible truth, that Michael Carter had been the victim of the greatest betrayal of his life. What followed was not the theatrics of a television drama, but the slow, careful unraveling of a lie 15 years in the making. Forensic accountants explained how signatures had been forged. Former employees, finally free of the fear that had silenced them, admitted they had been quietly threatened into staying silent. And then came the moment the entire courtroom would remember for years afterward, when Emily called Daniel Reed himself to the stand and asked him, calmly, to explain a wire transfer bearing his personal signature routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Daniel smiled the same warm, practiced smile he had used on Michael 1,000 times, and said he had no knowledge of any such transfer, that it must be some clerical error. And Emily, without raising her voice even slightly, opened her briefcase and placed a single photograph on the evidence table. A photograph of Daniel meeting privately with a bank officer in Grand Cayman on a date he had told everyone he was home sick with the flu. The color drained from his face in front of the entire room, his composure cracking for just a single second before he caught himself. But that 1 second was enough, and everyone in that courtroom saw exactly who Daniel Reed really was. As the truth unfolded, Michael finally understood why his daughter had disappeared for 15 years. She had not abandoned him. She had sacrificed every ordinary birthday, every holiday, every quiet, unremarkable evening most people take for granted, so that she could become exactly the lawyer capable of proving his innocence if the day ever came. And some instinct deep inside her, some memory of a father who once knelt in the frost to save her, had told her that day might come. When the jury foreman finally stood and read the verdict, not guilty on every single charge, there was no eruption of celebration in that room, only a heavy, stunned silence. Michael rose slowly from his seat, his legs unsteady beneath him, and turned to look at the daughter who had once entered his life hungry, grieving, and utterly alone, and who had now returned to save the only family she had left. "I thought I saved you,"
he whispered, his voice breaking on every word. Emily's eyes filled with tears she finally allowed herself to shed, and she stepped forward and took his trembling hands in hers. "You did," she said softly, "and then you taught me how to save you." That evening, away from the cameras and the reporters still shouting questions outside the courthouse steps, Michael and Emily sat together in the kitchen of the old mansion, at the same table where he had once eaten cake alone every year on her birthday. And for the first time in 15 years, there were 2 slices on the table, and both of them were eaten. They did not talk about the trial. They talked about small things, her law school roommates, his terrible attempts at cooking, the lake house they promised to visit again come summer. And somewhere in that quiet, ordinary conversation, both of them understood that the true verdict had already been delivered years earlier, on a frozen night under a railway bridge, when a hungry little girl chose honesty over money, and a broken man chose love over everything else he thought mattered. Michael Carter walked out of that courthouse with his name cleared and his empire eventually rebuilt. But he would tell anyone who asked in the quiet years that followed that none of it, not the company, not the fortune, not his name back in the papers, ever meant as much to him as the moment his daughter walked back through those courtroom doors and reminded him what family truly means. If this story moved you tonight, if you believe love and loyalty can outlast even the longest silence, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the Kind Souls Stories, because families like this one deserve to be remembered. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that reminds us what really matters in this life. If you believe kindness always finds its way home, hit subscribe and join our family of kind souls today. This story carries a meaningful lesson about the difference between charity and love, showing that true kindness is measured not by the size of a gift, but by the willingness to show up completely for another person without condition. It also speaks to patience and quiet loyalty, reminding viewers that some acts of love remain invisible for years before their full meaning is finally revealed, and that redemption is always possible for someone willing to change because one person once believed they could.